I recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Gottlieb, for being here with us today. In testimony earlier today, you were talking about the definition of terminal. I would note that neither House bill, neither Mr. Fitzpatrick and Mr. Biggs's or mine, goes the step beyond terminal, that the Senate went, and I can appreciate that. Then we got into, what the definition of terminal ought to be. I'm happy to work with you all on that. I think, if I remember correctly, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that you indicated somewhere around 20% survival odds was where you would probably put it. I'd probably push it a little higher.
I wouldn't. I didn't
I misunderstood.
mean to suggest that there's an objective figure. I was just using the example of a patient who's given a very grim prognosis. I would certainly consider 20% odds of survival grim.
And I would too, and I think that's where this is coming from. I might push that a little higher if anything less than 50-50. If it were me, I'd want to be able to find out what was out there.
It was grim when I was told it was 90% odds of living 5 years. That felt pretty grim at the time too, Congressman.
Yes, sir. I can appreciate that. So I want to work with you on that, but I do think that we need to pass something, and we'll try to figure it out. But I can see where you're concerned about chronic, but FDA was created in 1906 to protect Americans, not to get in the way of them taking treatment. And I will, if it were to be me, and right now I'm fine, but as Ms. Eshu said, we're all one diagnosis away from facing something. I would take the chance at the silver bullet or the Hail Mary. And we are going to hear testimony later today that some wealthier Americans are going to other countries to get treatments or to get drugs. And so my question would be, if it's already been approved somewhere else and you have a terminal diagnosis, why shouldn't you be able to get that in the United States?
Well, I think you're touching on the issue of reciprocity, which is some legislation that's been introduced in other settings, whether or not FDA should predicate approvals here in the U.S. on the basis of foreign approvals. And we're certainly happy to work with Congress on those legislative ideas. The framework that we operate in right now is a requirement that we determine safety and efficacy based on our statute and clinical trials that we work with sponsors to conduct and evaluate. Another element of this consideration is also relying more on foreign data, which we are doing as a matter of regulatory policy, and that's something we can do without new legislative authority. We can do that within the constructs of our current regulatory considerations, and we're looking for ways to do that.
And I appreciate that, and I appreciated your comments earlier about some of the new things that you're doing and that you're announcing today, and appreciate that as well. The GAO report found that when the FDA did not allow a request for expanded access to proceed, one of the reasons listed was due to the requested drug's demonstrated lack of efficacy for its intended use. But what if data showed that the intended use may not have been the intended use, but that it actually had benefits that were unexpected in another area, and you're facing that terminal illness that it does have the benefit for? I'm just curious how the FDA would deal with that in its current process.
Well, most of the cases where we're authorizing or allowing drugs to be used, the 99% of the cases where we allow patients to use drugs in the setting of expanded access, it's in a setting that is not the intended use of the product, the use for which the drug itself is being studied. So it's in an unstudied indication, or an indication that might be being evaluated in very small clinical trials. When the GAO says that it was something, when we didn't allow it to be used in something unproven because of something we knew, typically it was something we knew because we get a lot of clinical data from a lot of different sponsors, and we might know that a drug in a certain class doesn't work in that class because of other data that we're seeing. And so then we might make a judgment that we shouldn't allow that drug to be made available in a setting of expanded access when we have objective proof that it's not going to provide any benefit. I mean, bear in mind, we know that 70% of all drugs that are offered in an expanded access setting are never approved by FDA. So the vast majority of people who will use a drug through expanded access are using a drug that doesn't work.
And I appreciate that. I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to make one last comment. I do think that the two House versions both have device in there. I think we should keep that. because as you said, science is moving fairly quickly. That's one of the reasons that people want to try these things before you all have had a chance. There's some wonderful things out there with science. Again, if I had a diagnosis with inoperable cancer and they had a new nanobot technology, I'd be finding out where I could get that. And that's considered a medical device, and it may be very, very helpful. Not ready yet, but if it were when I was ready or needed it, I'd want to be able to use it. Thank you so much for your time, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back, Chair. Thanks.